Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world in 30 answers. Discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Allison Levine, and today I'm with Brandon Sparks-Gillis from Dragonette Cellars in San Ynez Valley. We're in the town of Los Olivos, and Brandon is the co-owner and co-winemaker of this lovely winery. And Brandon, welcome, and tell us about Dragonette.
Thanks for having me, Allison. Thanks for coming up here. Dragonette exists essentially to tell the story of the San Ynez Valley in Santa Barbara, California. So we're a small outfit. It's myself and two good friends who happen to be born brothers, John and Steve Dragonette. And the two of them obviously knew each other since birth. John and I had the fortuitous chance to meet working at a really great wine shop in Los Angeles in the early 2000s. And at that time, we were just starting to kind of explore the area. John and Steve had watched Santa Barbara County from nascency since they grew up in Southern California. And what was happening up here was just incredibly exciting. And so we made a little wine together kind of on a hobby scale in 2003 and 2004. And then dove in 2005 with a whopping 300 cases of wine.
Wow. So today, tell me if you, do you own any vineyards? Are you leasing, a combination? What's your situation with grapes?
So with grapes, that's the most fundamental thing, obviously. We do not own any land, but we work with what we feel is almost the best of the best to represent the diversity of Santa Barbara County. And so a lot of those relationships are long-term per acre contracts. Mm-hmm. So there's vineyards like Fiddlesticks, where John actually apprenticed under one of the local pioneers, Kathy Joseph, back in the day, and we've worked with that vineyard essentially since 2006. So there's certain vineyards where we've worked with for a really long time, and others where we've been part of kind of new developments and kind of pushing new boundaries. So we were among the first to ever source grapes at vineyards like Radian and Bent Rock and the very far western side of the Santa Rita Hills.
Good vineyards.
Yeah, Rita's Crown would be another one of those. And so it's this great mix of kind of classic, and it would be the same thing in Happy Canyon. We'll kind of, I'm sure, break down what we make where. But in Sauvignon Blanc and Happy Canyon, we worked with Vogelsang, which is one of the oldest vineyards, and Grimm's Bluff, which is one of the newest.
And with all these vineyards, I mean, obviously, you're speaking about a lot of Santa Rita Hills, so you've got Pinot and Chard. Are you working exclusively with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, or what other grapes?
So in terms of the grape breakdown, we work with Sauvignon Blanc and Grenache for Rosé from the Happy Canyon of Santa Barbara AVA, so the far eastern side of the valley. And then moving way out to the west, Santa Rita Hills were dominantly Pinot Noir with a little bit of Chardonnay and also a little bit of Syrah from both Santa Rita Hills and Ballard Canyon. Oh. And then there are the little outlying vineyards. We work with a really great vineyard called Duvarita, which exists in its own spot out in the middle of nowhere, which is technically Santa Barbara County. It's adjacent to the Santa Rita Hills. It's west of Santa Rita Hills.
Ah, nice. And your total case production?
That depends because most of the contracts are per acre, so Mother Nature makes that decision, but we aim for about 6,000 cases in total each year.
Okay. If Mother Nature's nice.
Yes. There are some years. 2017, most recently, we made 4,500 cases. So, I mean, it can spin up or down just a little bit, but that's the general idea. The idea is to be in sort of a zone of production where we can be very hands-on and, very, very focused on each and every grape that we're working with.
And where are your wines available? Are they in the market? Are they available nationally? Or are you just direct to consumer?
So most of what we do is direct to consumer. So between Wine Club, mailing list, and tasting room, that represents the lion's share of what we do. But we do have wines, certain wines that we work with, particularly within the state of California. We have a really great broker arrangements throughout the state of California. And then a very, very, very small amount is allocated to a couple markets like New York, DC, Virginia, and Texas.
So, about you, what is your first memory relevant to wine? I mean, I know you're a student of wine and very passionate about it, but what's your first memory of it?
My first memory of wine came when I was in college. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, on the western side of the state of Washington, where there was no grapes grown, in a family that didn't touch not even wine, but not even alcohol, so I didn't really have any exposure. But I ended up going to school at a small school in Walla Walla, which was at the time a budding wine region. And so the first memories that I have would be essentially driving across the state of Washington and seeing these really interesting vineyards perched in places like Red Mountain, or Walla Walla itself throughout the valley. And what fascinated me really early on was just that link between, what I now know is terroir. Where I just see these crazy grapes clinging to a hillside and then thinking that, wow, you can actually taste that place. And so that was the thing that really captivated me early on.
Wow. So now I know that I've known you for years now, and I know you've been working on your Master of Wine, so you're tasting wine all the time and traveling the world and such. But is there one wine that sticks out, one of those aha moments? It could have been earlier in your career or recent, where it just, either triggered something in wanting to make wine and wanting to focus on something, or just was just the time and place and the people you were with?
That's obviously a big question, and I could bring up hundreds of different scenarios. But I think one that's kind of interesting would be the wines from Didier Dagenot from Pouilly-Fumé, now Vin de France, actually. Those wines, that was actually a little further into my wine journey. I'd kind of heard of them, fairly legendary wines, and I just remember the first time tasting those wines, it was a bit of a lightning bolt. It was just something that it was just, to me, they were wines that sort of even transcended the capabilities of the variety. They were like super Sauvignon Blanc. They were something that was so unique and interesting. And that definitely has informed, both just in terms of personal pleasure and drinking, but tying it back to Dragonette, those are some of the wines that John and Steve and I really bonded on early on and gave us inspiration for, what we ended up doing.
So as you've traveled the world tasting all these different wines and visiting wine regions, do you think that there's one particular wine region that stands out as, I can't say the best wine, but is there one region that stands out that you're just like, wow, this is the place?
Again, that's a loaded question, and we could go on for hours. I will say this, that there's certain things. There's classic regions. I've spent through the Master of Wine program, spent a bit of time in Bordeaux, and I just have been the more the time that I spend in Bordeaux, the more that I love the wines and the people and think that that's fantastic. But I have to say that the more that I travel, the more I have the context to become aware of how special Santa Barbara County is. So I know that's a little bit of a kind of a home court thing, but it is something that seemingly on every trip I go on, I'll be inspired and really excited. And obviously I'm very omnivorous in what I personally drink and what we drink here at Dragonette. We love wines from all around the planet. But what's happening here is pretty special. And I'll have to give a couple little shout outs too, because sure. I think that what's happening in Spain at the moment is something that's really, really unique. You have this incredible blend of super classic regions like Rioja and Ribera del Duero. And then you have just these incredibly kind of maverick, sometimes with new plantings, but oftentimes old vines. Like if you look at what's going on in Sierra de Gredos with Grenache, or if you look at what's going on in Valdehoras, with Mencia, Gudela. There's just, it's a place that to me, that's another spot that during the travels felt like it was just really, really exciting. And just the wines from top to bottom, from everyday wines to the most iconic, just seem like they're hitting new heights.
So if we were to come to your home and enter your wine cellar, and which I can't even imagine how large it is or what you have, but what would we find in there? What do you have a broad range? Do you have a lot of local? Is there a specific variety or region that you really focus on at home?
It's very broad. It's very, very broad, intentionally broad, because I think that's just part of the fun of it. I think that drinking wine is just, it's a way to constantly discover. And so there's definitely a really huge range. There are certain producers that I follow that would have a little bit more depth. Mm-hmm. And those range from, esoteric European. Francois Cotat in Sancerre is a producer that I've bought year in and year out for a couple of decades now. So there's a good chunk of that. And then there's also things like, from the home state. I grew up in Washington State, and I'm really fond of, even though the grapes are grown in Oregon, of Cayuse. That'd be another one that definitely takes up a good little chunk in the cellar. But there's wines from all over the place. And I think that's just the fun of wine.
So is there anything you opened up recently that drank really well?
Ooh, that's...
What'd you drink last night?
Water. No, most recently I've been in training for the MW exam, so it's been just a ton of classics, which has been a lot of fun. So most memorably, had a fun flight last week that featured Cristal, Dom, and Krug, which was not a bad flight.
Life is tough for you. So do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
No. And I think that's because, we're dealing with nature. Mm-hmm. And I think that each grape variety, and if you look at the history of wine, grape varieties have evolved. It's, fascinating to think, which grapes' parents were to get which offspring. And so I think that, though there's definitely certain grapes that I do think, if we were really, I think that there is The reason that the noble grapes are called the noble grapes is because they can produce wines that have just astonishing ability to show place and to develop and improve over time, which that's one big thing. I think that one of the definitions of greatness for me is for the ability for a wine to improve over time. And so there are certain grapes that definitely are more suited to that. But at the same point in time, I can't say that I prefer Syrah to Pinot Noir or Cabernet to Merlot. I mean, it all depends.
No, absolutely. So, one of those things that a lot of people guide because they're seeking perfection. It's elusive. It's defined differently by every person, but some people turn to scores to define greatness. What's your opinion on wine critics and scores?
Big topic. I think, as we know. And again, even within that, things could go one way or the other.
Sure.
I could find dozens of examples to kind of argue the pros and the cons. But I think that ultimately it's a really good thing. I think that when you look at wine culture, particularly in emerging cultures, the United States I'd still say is emergent. And then if you look at Asia now, it's definitely something that is definitely emerging. I think that critics play a really key role, particularly in those contexts, just in terms of... maybe it used to be called gatekeeper, and I think now it would be something that maybe more could just give somebody the confidence to be excited about a certain wine.
Right.
And so I think that the critics who actually will get out and particularly spend time in the regions that they're writing about, I have really great respect for that, because there's particular wine critics who have tasted way more Santa Barbara wines than I have this year. And so they have that ability to have context and to kind of filter things through. And so I think that, from a perspective of just, passing along information and knowledge to people who are excited about wine, that's a really important thing. I think if you get down into really trying to micromanage the minutia of, what's the difference between a 98-point wine and a 97-point wine.
What is the difference?
The day, like the moment, like the company that you're with.
Absolutely.
That it can get a little more contentious. But I think overall it's a good thing. And I think that there is the more that I'm involved with wine and as time goes on, the more respect actually I do have for expertise. I think that that's one thing that it's really cool that in this day and age, anybody with a phone can pop on Instagram or YouTube and start to talk about things they're excited about. But at the end of the day, somebody who's tasted, every vintage of a certain wine, they're going to have a better perspective in order to inform somebody about that wine. And so I think that is more and more important today, even though a lot of people would argue it's less and less important.
Well, for you as a wine drinker, red, white, or rosé?
All of the above.
Still or sparkling?
All of the above.
I know, too easy of a question, right? So, because you drink so many wines and wines from around the world in different styles, different grape varieties, how do you approach food and wine pairing? Do you feel that there are rules to follow? White wine and fish, red wine and meat? Or do you do a come what may attitude? Do you pick your wine first or your food first? Like, how do you approach it? Or do you approach it at all? Do you just enjoy?
Primarily just enjoy, but I think that the approach that I would say is just drink what you like and eat what you like. And so, for me, that depends. So if I'm going home tonight and I swing by the Finley farm stand and find some really remarkable tomatoes, I might find, some Tuscan wine that I think is super phenomenal to drink with those. But I'm not that fussy about it. Again, I think that it's just important to enjoy yourself, and I think wine should first and foremost be about pleasure. Same with food.
Sure.
It's sustenance, it's pleasure. It can go from the most humble to the most ultimate experience. But then the other thing with being kind of excited and omnivorous about all this is that most of the time, particularly now with the advent of the Coravin, oftentimes I'll have 5 or 6 glasses in front of me at dinner, and I think that's the most fun.
So for somebody who hasn't had the pleasure of tasting Dragonette wines yet, what do you think they're missing out on?
I think it's a matter of just having that moment of discovery. I think one of the good things about bar production being small is that we're able to be really hands-on with every part of the process, and that can bring up the quality. One of the downsides of that is that the wines are less available. Mm-hmm. And I think about that a lot because I have friends around the globe, and my friend Aaron in Israel can't go to a wine shop and buy our wine. It's a very major project to get the wine from here to there. So I think it's just a matter of kind of having that discovery, and I think that the most important thing that I would say that we're trying to do is really represent what's exciting about Santa Barbara County. And I think that there's an incredible diversity here. So hopefully people who can discover our wines can kind of discover that moment as well.
So if space aliens were to land on your property right now, which of your wines would you want to welcome them with? Which would be the welcome to Dragonette?
All of them.
Well, they have to start with one.
Given that we're sitting here in August, I would start with one of our Sauvignon Blancs. I just think that'd be, for the summertime, that'd be a great way to start and a great bit of expression, and also something that I think is really unique.
Now, you were talking in 2017, Mother Nature, you said at the very beginning, kind of gives you what your total production is going to be. In 2017, you had less, and, every year is different. We know every vintage tells a different story. But in the years that you've been here in Santa Barbara County, do you find more similarity from vintage to vintage, or do you see bigger variation? What have you sort of noticed is the pattern here, or is there no pattern?
There's a little bit of a pattern. I mean, one thing that can be said is that because we're such a young region and there's a lot of producers, ourselves included in this, that are helping to push the bar and have that goal of constantly refining and improving viticultural techniques and winemaking techniques. I know that our goal is to make better wine every single year, even though that might be incremental in certain years or whatnot. And we're really blessed with a climate that allows us to oftentimes kind of be in that driver's seat. I mean, having a place where we don't have the punctuation marks. I mean, if you're in a certain place where the rain's going to start to come at a certain point and it's not going to let up, then you might be forced to pick at a certain time.
We don't worry about rain here.
Which here, I mean, knock on wood, now there are other things. We're more worried about the sun than we are about rain. And so I think that affords us the ability to have really great consistency from vintage to vintage. But the one thing that's been really interesting is particularly since 2014, there's been a little bit of a dynamic between the even and the odd years, in the sense that the even years have resulted in wines that are really approachable and tend to drink really, really well young. They age beautifully as well, but they're much more generous in their fruit and their textures to really reward the early drinking, where the odd vintages have had a little bit more structure to them. And so we actually, among friends around here, we kind of debate this. I think that, for the wines that are age-worthy, some of those odd years are probably going to be the longest distance runners. But, in the immediate time right now, I mean, the even years are just drink so well out of the gates that it's kind of hard to wait.
So when you're in the vineyard, are there any sort of signs or predictors or omens, not necessarily in a bad way, that will tell you what kind of vintage you're going to get? Are there things you look for that help you, look forward and anticipate what's coming?
To some degree. I mean, again, wine is definitely the sum of the parts. And when you look at the growing season, there's a lot. I mean, there's a million different variables, so it's really hard to boil it down. But some of the things that we look at canopy growth early on in the season. And that's a bit of a Goldilocks thing. We really prefer it to be kind of slow and measured, not too much, but not too little. You need enough leaves to ripen the grapes,
just
not
right.
too many. Which, of course, again, that's something that we don't really control. So canopy growth early on to be one thing. Crop level is something that you can manage. And I think that's something that's more and more critical to kind of pay attention to look at. And that's something where there's different points of view. We have certain friends who, because they're making wines that are really made to be kind of wines of enjoyment really early on, they actually like to have more fruit on the vine. We like to have less because we want the wines to kind of have more concentration and more power to develop over time. But that's one thing that can really influence a vintage. I mean, and if you have a warm year, having a little extra crop can be really good to kind of help regulate the vines as you get closer to harvest. And then the other thing, so we're sitting here at the very beginning of August, and one of the things that we're looking at in the vineyards really closely right now is the lignification of the canes. So essentially each year the plant goes through the vegetative growth stage, grows up the canopy, puts out the fruit, goes from bloom to fruit set. Right around now we're also starting to see veraison. And one of the sort of signature things that we can look at in terms of importance in the vintage is that if the plant starts to switch from true vegetative growth, just producing leaves and growing upwards and growing shoots, to ripening, where it's really concentrating on creating great maturity and flavor in the grapes, that can be the sign of a really good vintage. And so right now we're seeing a number of places where you can see the canes turn from green to kind of a yellow to then kind of a brown. They essentially do turn from green growing plant into wood over the course of that size of the season. And at that stage right now, seeing that happening, that lignification happening in advance of veraison is something we love, because it just means it sets us up for really great physiological maturity of the plant and the grapes.
Wow, that is one of the most comprehensive, and it makes so much sense. I love it. So, in the years that you and the Dragonette brothers have been doing this project, have you guys established any sort of rituals, good luck rituals at the start of harvest?
We're not big on ritual. Yeah, no, I mean, we do tend to try to get together and drink some good wine with our whole crew prior to the start of harvest. So we'll be doing that here shortly. But for the most part, what we're doing is as close as harvest nears, we're just spending more and more and more time in the vineyards. And so to that sense, I think that I guess maybe one of the things that is ritualistic of it is just being present. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing that truly, the closer you are to your vines, the closer you are to your fruit, the more your finger's on the pulse of what's happening. And that's something that can be, whether it's ritualistic or not, it can definitely be a really great thing in terms of being able to make really precise calls on harvest dates and know when it's time to pick the grapes.
Well, so since you spend so much time in the vineyards, especially close to harvest, what kind of relationship do you have with the grapes? Have you been known to talk to them? Is there a level of communication, or does that translate into the cellar? Do you talk to your wine? I know it's a little mystical at times, but if you're spending a lot of time at the end in the vineyards, clearly, you're getting to know your grapes very well.
That is true. There is a connectivity there for sure. It's maybe less physical in terms of talking. I mean, we touch a lot. You're micromanaging. You're kind of pulling leaves and adjusting fruit and clusters and all that. And I think that there is a huge advantage to the more the vines feel that energy, I'm sure that actually makes better wine.
So, if you could, some people read tea leaves at the bottom of a cup of tea, right? To see the future. If you could look at the bottom of a red wine glass, what would you want it to tell you?
At the bottom of the glass, that's oftentimes and this is the bottom of the bottle, especially. That's oftentimes the times that you start to get signals for where the wine might go in the future, because there's been that time of aeration in the glass, or even over the night in the bottle as the bottle's being emptied. And so I actually think that that's a really fun time to kind of actually take that last, really great sniff and see what evolution has happened. I mean, it's fun if you're drinking an older wine. That's really cool to kind of see that evolution, and the evolution might be kind of towards the end of the phase. Where for the younger wines, it's really quite cool, I think, at the end to be able to watch and see where that's going. How's it developing? How's it improving?
So you said that you grew up not related to wine whatsoever. When you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up? Clearly, winemaker was not like your focus.
Depends on when in youth. There was times where being a professional skateboarder or snowboarder would have been the thing. Then there was times where being a geologist would have been the focus. But what's interesting is that wine and grape growing have incorporated a lot of those things, particularly from the geologic realm. I mean,
I was going to say, not really with snowboarding.
A little bit. There's moments of inspiration, right?
But so geology. So did you study geology, or what did you study in school?
Yes, I ended up getting a degree in geology.
Before you found your way to wine.
It was during. That process was really interwoven, because as I was learning more about geology, I had the good fortune to go spend time in Europe. So I spent a summer studying geology in Italy and came home realizing that I actually wanted to work in wine, not strictly the rocks.
It's what Italy does to you, right? I mean, it's just on the table all the time. You just start drinking it.
A little cliche, but it's very inspiring over there.
So when you're not working, how do you like to spend your free time?
I like to be outside. Yeah, so whether it's hiking, bodyboarding, surfing,
snowboarding.
Not so much these days on that. We're a ways from the mountains. But yeah, just being outside is like the best thing.
And when you're, jumping over a little bit, if you're planning a romantic evening for you and your wife, what sort of wines make for a romantic evening? What sets the tone, or for you guys? I mean, I'm going to guess like old wine, champagne, but is there something specific that sort of sets that mood for you too?
It's actually pretty simple. So as dorky as I am and as completely fascinated and into the minutiae of wine, my wife is essentially the exact opposite. So her definition of wine is either it's okay or wow, this is really good. So we just aim for the really good part.
It's like a big challenge, huh?
It depends.
But you know what she likes.
We know what we like now.
So when you look back at your career or in life, we're given a lot of advice from people, from teachers, mentors, friends, family. Is there a piece of advice that you were given at any point along the way that helps guide you in life or in work or how you run your business? Or
Good question, because again, we've been fortunate to have both myself and John and Steve really incredible mentors and people who we've kind of worked with over the years. So there's been a lot of it. But I think one that's actually kind of a clever little nugget is back in the early days where we were making the first vintage that we ever made, which was not a Dragonette wine, it was just a Pobby wine, was made in John Dragonette's garage. And that year there was a number of different things where, we were making wine, literally the grapes were growing up in Santa Barbara County, we were still living and working down in the Los Angeles area. And some of the advice that we got that year were just little things, but the advice that kept coming up, and it was less advice and more just a comment, was, well, you won't do that again next year. And the reason it's important is that there are things, I still will never forget this. One of the kind of proto vintages that we made, we got to the point that we got this was again before the Dragonette brand, we had a little corner in this teeny little warehouse, or big warehouse, called Central Coast Wine Services. Mm-hmm. In Gray Hartley of Hitching Post, we were kind of in and out. Unfortunately, during harvest, we had to jump back and forth to work. And Gray came up one day and he had this kind of devious little grin that he often has, and he says, "Making wine by phone, huh? That'll be interesting." And so that combined with the "you won't do that again next year," the thing that we learned incredibly fast, we made a lot of great mistakes in those couple of years as home winemakers, was that you need to be completely present. So you need to be in the vineyards, you need to be close to the vineyards. So now, all of the vineyards that we work with are within about a 10 or 15 minute drive from our winery. Need to be in the winery, particularly at those critical stages. Mm-hmm. You need to know when to be hands-on and when to let go. And so that's been probably the most significant bit of advice.
And that's great advice for obviously being a winemaker, but it's advice one can apply to anything in life. You have to be present at all times.
Mindfulness and wine have a lot of overlap, that's true.
So when you look back at your career, what would you say is one of your proudest achievements to date? Obviously you've learned from your mistakes in making wine, but what would you say is one of your proudest achievements?
I think the proudest achievement is building the incredible fabric of team and community that we've had. If you look at it now from the vineyard partners that we work with, it's an amazingly diverse group of people, from really humble backyard farmers to billionaires who own vineyards. And then when you actually get closer to the core of our team in terms of what we have, who's in the cellar, who's in the tasting room, who's leading winery appointments, the sense of people and community are the thing that I would be absolutely most proud of. And I think that there's some little tie-ins there too, because we were early on very excited about organics. And that's something that has gone from something where we first started asking growers about organics, we were met with incredible skepticism, especially from vineyard management companies. And fortunately, the tide seems to be turning in that regard. And so that'd be something that, if we could have the tiniest little bit of influence on that, I'd feel really proud about that.
So when you talk about community, and wine is something that we like to share with people, we're sitting around a table, your wine's on the table, you got an empty seat next to you. Is there one person from any walk of life, living or deceased, that you'd love to share a bottle of Dragonette with?
That'd have to be, that's a tough question. It'd probably have to be my mom. She passed away a while ago, but she never drank wine, ever.
But drinking your wine would have converted her.
That might be interesting.
So, complete this sentence for me. A table without wine is like?
A song without music.
Oh, beautifully said. Just lining us right up to pairing wine and music, which is coming very soon. But I'm curious because I do have to ask you this question, and this is going to make you pick wine. I know this is a tough one because you drink so much wine. But if you were sent off on a deserted island, what 3 wines would you want to take with you?
Well, I'm glad there's 3. That's important. One of them would clearly have to be champagne, because if you're on a deserted island, it's probably tropical. You need something refreshing.
Of course.
Then it gets really challenging, because it depends on where you are in the world and what's going on. Are you looking for specific wines? Are we talking about?
It's up to you. I get the feeling you're broad enough that you're going to give me a category, but I'd love to know if you could go specific.
No, I'm going to stay really vague then. Yeah. I think it actually comes back to some of the classics. I mean, I think Chardonnay is just a grape that can do so many different things. It can be so delicious young. It can be so delicious old. That would have to have a place at the table. And then the first grape that really super captivated me as I was falling in love with wine was Syrah. And that to this day is one of my all-time favorites. Again, that's no discredit to Pinot Noir. But I guess those would be the three categories.
Well, we know where Champagne's from, but is there a particular place the Chardonnay or the Syrah would come from? Old world, new world, cool climate, warmer climate?
It'd have to come from all over the place.
You get 3 wines.
3 wines. I mean, if it was today, I've had a real soft spot. I've been enjoying Margaret River Chardonnays, like Vas Felix and Lewin and Cullen a lot lately. So, I mean, for today, that'd be the answer.
Okay, so we got a little answer. We'll get you more specific in a second. So yeah, let's get a little more specific about your wines. You've talked a little bit about how it's about community and sharing wine, and wine conjures up emotions and feelings a lot based on who you're with and when you're drinking it, right? There's a time and a place for everything. But we've got a few of your wines here, I want you to pair them with music. It can be a genre or a specific song, but what it conjures up, what you'd want to be listening to or what it makes you think of. So I'm going to start here with your Chardonnay from the Duvarita vineyard. Tell me a little bit about that and what you think it makes you think of.
So Duvarita itself, you talked a little bit about mysticism a little bit earlier on. Duvarita is a magical little location. It's essentially an ancient sand dune that's located, it's one of the closest vineyards to the ocean in all of Santa Barbara County. It tends to be very extreme in the sense that it has huge ocean influence throughout the year, and a lot of marine influence. Develops an incredible kind of salinity. The farming there is really intense. It was one of the first vineyards in the valley to be certified biodynamic back in right around the turn of the 2000s. And it's one of the first vineyards that's not yet certified, but it's been farmed regeneratively. And in terms of pairing that, I'm trying to. This one that gets a little bit challenging, but I'd probably actually put something ambient with it, because I think that one of the things being in that vineyard that's so exciting, and the ranges of emotions go up and down, right? Because it's beautiful, it's magical. It also has some parts of the vineyard that are struggling with disease and some, vine age issues. So it's pretty contemplative. So for that one, I would actually pick something like some of the selected ambient works from Aphex Twin. It's a pretty obscure artist, but some of them are really blissful and beautiful. Some of them are a little more tense and, fraught. And I think that that's the truth about farming, and so I think that would be a fun thing to listen to out there.
Wow, I like that. Let's see, we've got, let's jump over to Pinot Noir. The Radiant Vineyard, because I know that's a pretty special vineyard. What about your 2020 Pinot Noir Radiant Vineyard?
Well, much like Duvarita, Radiant also feels like you're at the edge of the earth, and it truly is a place of extremes. Mm-hmm. And the wine, I think, shows that. I think the wine, it's one of my favorite things about Radiant is that when within wine, it's easy to sort of talk about terroir and get into some of the sort of cliched moments of that. But truly, when you're at Radiant, the vineyard is just over 100 acres planted on what's essentially almost a 4,000 acre property. And so obviously, having that differential, there's a ton of wildness around there. There's a lot of chaparral, there's some crazy, amazing old oaks, and then there's also plenty of poison oak and things that are...
And diatomaceous earth.
And diatomaceous earth, of course. We can get to that. So in terms of putting those extremes, but again, you get a sense of that in the glass. I mean, when I smell Radiant, I literally smell that savory nature of the chaparral and the dirt, and also the beautiful berries. It's a lot like being in a forest. Grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and there are plenty of times at Radiant where I really feel like I'm actually in an old growth forest in terms of just what you're smelling and what you're sensing and the way the wind is so influential and the fog and the mist. So with that, let's see here. We need to have something moody. We listen to a wide diversity of music when we're out in the vineyard, so it's kind of hard to pick one thing. But I'd probably actually put that with like Vivaldi's Four Seasons, because you get like these movements, and if you're there in the morning when it's really foggy, it's kind of like winter. And if you're there in the afternoon when the sun is out for that moment before the wind starts howling, it's kind of like summer. So yeah, I'd call the Four Seasons on that one.
I like that. And then you've got your 2019 Syrah 7. I know that Syrah, has a little special place in your heart. So what about this wine?
So with 7, this takes a little bit of a different approach, where we've gone from a couple wines that were very much about that specific place, the single vineyard concept. 7 is the ultimate example of the symphonic effect. So this is fruit from multiple vineyards where we're intentionally using the different vineyards to build more complexity and completeness in the wine. Mm-hmm. So I'd have to say that this, and I'll give a little bit of a nod here to Steve Dragonette though, because what I would actually say with this is, because it is Syrah from Santa Rita Hills and Ballard Canyon, it has this incredible mix between beauty and power. I think that's one of the greatest things about Syrah and the things that makes it so versatile. So I would actually say that this is, I said it's symphonic, so we've got the symphony going, but this is the symphony playing with Metallica for that power.
Ooh, wow. I like your descriptions. I mean, I could keep going. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Well, we got to do one more wine, because you told me your favorite wine is a Puy Fusé. Puy Fumé, and then you're a big fan of Sancerre, and you make a Sauvignon Blanc. So we've got the Grimm's Bluff Vineyard 2020 Sauvignon Blanc. Your last one.
All right, so Grimm's Bluff it's a fascinating property. It sits on a bluff. That's what it's called. That it kind of has this overlook that sees the San Ynez Range and the Los Padres Mountains. And it's at the opposite extreme. So if vineyards like Duvernay and Radian are the closest to the ocean in Santa Barbara County, Grimm's Bluff sits all the way at the eastern side of the valley in Happy Canyon, so it's kind of up in the foothills of the mountains. And because of that, it tends to have this incredible diurnal swing. So we have some of the warmest daytime high temperatures, but we also have some of the coldest nighttime lows. And then Grimm's also has this interesting contrast. It has a few feet of clay overlying these cobblestones, these river rocks. I mean, our label color is this kind of beigey gray, and it was literally designed in the color of the sandstone cobbles from down below. So again, another vineyard that has bits of extremes, so it need to be something really, really dynamic. Music that would fit Grimm's, that has the dynamism, that has, let's see here, where would we go with that? I'll go a little old school on that one. I think that there's a few Jane's Addiction songs that could fit, that would actually be quiet and blissful, and then just burst into something kind of like a little more intense and loud, and that's kind of that day-night dynamic of Grimm's.
I love it. Brandon, you were great. That was awesome. So, we're just about finished. I have 2 final questions for you. The first is, where in the world is at the top of your bucket list to go explore, wine-wise? And you've explored a lot, and I know you love to explore. So is there one place that's next?
It's a tie. I'll actually have to give 2 places, kind of an old world and new world thing. Of all the places I've traveled, for some reason I have yet to go to the Rhone. So I really, really want to spend some time in the Rhone. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, and the opposite side of the world, I mentioned loving Margaret River Chardonnay. I'd love to do a trip to the Margaret River region of Australia at some point. I mean, that's a place that I think there are some parallels to Santa Barbara in the sense that there's coastal influence. They're incredibly beautiful regions. I mean, outside of even just the beauty of the vineyards, but just the wildlife and the nature that's around there is exceptional. So that'd be a good spot to go.
2 great places to go. A third great place to go is to the San Ynez Valley, up here to Santa Barbara wine country. And if people want to plan a trip up here and they want to come visit, where can they find you? How can they find you, and what can they do here at Dragonette?
Yeah, come and visit. That's ultimately, as I would say with any region around the world, being there is the most important. And I mean, obviously, like, you've been able to spend so much time here, you know this very intimately. So getting here, we're located just about 45 minutes north of Santa Barbara in California. And it really feels, so what's amazing about Santa Barbara is that we're actually really close to one of the biggest metropolises on the planet. I mean, if you look at the sprawling nature of Los Angeles and Orange County and San Diego, a lot of times you're associating that with urban sprawl and kind of gritty city life. the San Ynez Valley is the absolute opposite of that. I mean, it's just so completely beautiful. It feels remote, and it feels you're kind of traveling back in time in California. So come and see us. Yeah, come and visit. I mean, again, not too far from both Santa Barbara or Los Angeles. The best way to get a hold of us, book a tasting, come to our website, dragonetecellars.com. We're also on Talk in terms of reservations, because most of our tastings are done by appointment. And we have experiences at our winery, which is in an industrial setting in Buellton. We have experiences here in Los Olivos, including private experiences, and also the tasting room that's a little more casual. But yeah, we welcome people, and it's one of the best ways to explore, because again, we're not an anomaly in this. I mean, a lot of the best wines in Santa Barbara County barely see, the marketplace in terms of distribution or export. And so taking the time to come and explore and taste around here, there's a lot to discover and a lot of great things to find.
Absolutely. Well, come on up to Los Olivos, charming little town, and the Dragonette wine tasting room is right here in the heart of the town, surrounded by a lot of other tasting rooms, so you can really fill a day of drinking and having fun. But definitely make a stop here. Brandon, thank you for joining us on Wine Soundtrack. I hope you had a good time, but it's been really fun, and let's go drink some wine.
Let's do it. Thanks so much, Allison. Appreciate your time. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.